Hello, I'm Tony Power, the founder and principal consultant at Just Culture Consulting based in Melbourne, Australia. And once again, I'm joined by Paul Stretton from the UK, who I think is one of the most innovative thinkers in the area of just culture. So welcome, Paul.
Hi, Tony. Thank you again for your very kind words, and keen to explore another conversation around just culture today. And in our previous video, we looked at the classical approach to just culture and how fair, consistent reactions to people following an adverse event can lead to a range of organizational benefits and hopefully reduce a sense of fear or blame people often experience at work. And so now I want to have a look at a different approach to just culture, namely a restorative just culture. And I thought to start with, Tony, it might be helpful, given your legal background, if you would like to give an explanation about where the idea more broadly of where restorative justice comes from.
Yeah, absolutely. So restorative justice, as we know it today, began as a response to mainly minor crimes, property crimes primarily, such as burglary, back in the 1970s. And it was used as an alternative to a normal criminal prosecution. But you can find examples of similar ideas to restorative justice going back hundreds of years. But the classic example would be, let's say you have a person who has shoplifted, and they would meet directly or indirectly, perhaps through intermediaries, with the shopkeeper. And the shopkeeper would give their account about how they had been impacted by what had happened, what the person did, and the person would give an account about what they did, and ideally would express genuine regret, apologise for the harm that was caused, and then both of them would have a facilitated discussion around how can the harm that's been caused, how can that be put right? How can things be restored? And the outcome of that discussion might vary. You might have a situation where the person agrees to stay away from the shop, or it might go the complete opposite direction, where the person actually does volunteer work in the shop for a period of time. Alternatively, maybe an apology is the end of the matter. So it's all about trying to heal and restore relationships and restore things that have been damaged or broken. And so probably the most large-scale example of restorative justice in recent times was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in post-apartheid South Africa. And in that context, you're dealing with large groups of people where you've got hurts that have been caused, going back for many, many years. And they define restorative justice as a process where all the stakeholders that have been affected by an injustice have an opportunity to discuss how they've been affected by that injustice and to decide what to do in order to repair the harm. So it's sort of, rather than the classical idea of justice, which is sort of treating people based on what they deserve, you did X, and so that therefore merits Y response. Restorative justice is about restoring relationships that have been damaged or broken as a result of some sort of unjust harm.
Thanks, Anne. I think that's really interesting. I think particularly striking is the scale at which, or the different scales in which you can apply these ideas around restorative just culture, whether it be very individual between two people and those relationships, or large-scale systemic relationships as well. And the idea of restorative just culture has been highly advocated by Sidney Dekker, and he explains an approach that obviously has a lot of its roots in terms of what you just talked about, and it aims to restore trust after an incident. So it looks for different parties to collaborate and repair the harm that has occurred. So by nature, it's a lot more of a relational, humanistic response to that kind of classical approach that we looked at last time, which is a bit more analytical and transactional between individuals and organizations. And so I think the other aspect that I think is really interesting with the restorative just culture approach is that Dekker redefines that idea of accountability that you just talked about at the end, about you did X, so it merits a certain response from somebody else. And instead, Dekker talks about accountability being forward-looking. So rather than being that account that you settle, it's about the stories that you tell afterwards. And so the solution is kind of co-created and agreed, and hopefully the solution then is it felt to be just by all the relevant parties. And I think that's quite an interesting approach. And so I wonder, Tony, with your experience, what do you feel that restorative just culture adds to the discussion overall with our approaches to just culture?
Yeah, so when it comes to restorative just culture, there are sort of three guiding questions that govern it. The first is who is hurt. So it's immediately saying that, okay, there's been some sort of harm or hurt or breakage here, and who's been affected by it. The second thing is then, okay, what do they need? So you say it's looking forward. It's okay, well, going forward, what is needed to restore those relationships, to repair those hurts? And then the third is, whose obligation is it to meet those needs? That will obviously encompass potentially a wide range of people, and that's one of the features of restorative just culture, perhaps that differs a little bit from the classic just culture, in that it encompasses a much wider group of people. So the person who has, or persons who have been harmed or damaged in some way, but also the person who, or people who have caused that harm, intentionally or unintentionally, but also the organisations that surround those people, and ultimately the wider community or regulators. So it's a much wider set of stakeholders that are involved in that process. The other thing is that it has a very strong emphasis on openness and truth telling, of people giving their truthful accounts about what happened and how they're affected by it. So to kind of work through briefly an example, one that has been in the news recently is an incident which where an air traffic controller who was in Cairns Approach in Australia, and he was working the night shift, and he was found sleeping by the next controller coming on shift. He was lying across two chairs with a blanket over him. Now, he hadn't intended to fall asleep, but that had happened. And looking at sort of some of the factors involved in that, there were personal factors by which, he was lying. The fact that he was lying across two chairs, he wasn't moving about or undertaking other activities that might have helped him maintain mental alertness. So there were some issues where perhaps he could have acted differently. But there are a number of systematic failure features going on as well. So the air conditioning in the building couldn't be adjusted. So it was actually quite commonplace during the night shift for people to have blankets because it was cold. The fact that obviously it was a night shift, the workload was very, very low. There were no aircraft in that controller's area. There weren't scheduled to be any aircraft in that controller's area. So there was very little for the controller to do work-wise. They'd also had a roster pattern with multiple consecutive night shifts due to staffing shortages. So the organisation had not put the controller in the best place as far as managing fatigue and an environment which would be conducive to helping him stay awake. So there are all sorts of issues going on in there. So if we're looking at that question around, okay, who is hurt? Well, the controller themselves. They might well. We don't necessarily know what they were feeling, but it would be unsurprising if they perhaps were feeling shame about what happened, worry about potentially losing their job, and so they could be quite adversely affected by what's happened. The organisation, the air traffic control organisation, will they need information about what happened so that they can learn from it and perhaps maybe make changes to their system. There might be reputational repair that they need to engage in. And the wider community might need information around what happened because they want to feel some reassurance about that the air traffic control is safe and that things are happening to make sure there isn't a reoccurrence. And so then looking at okay, who has the obligation to meet those needs? There are obligations across all of those stakeholders. So the air traffic controller has obligations around telling the truth, giving their account of what happened, perhaps expressing remorse for their part in the outcome, and contributing to the learning around how can we prevent these sort of things from happening in the future. Similarly, the air traffic control organisation needs to be willing to participate in this restorative process, perhaps offer help to the controller, to be accountable, and give their account about the system issues and what they and ways in which those can be rectified. And then the wider community needs to be willing to participate in that restorative process in some way, and express some understanding around the fact that we are human and fallible, and encouraging organisations to learn from these things that happen. So that so I guess ultimately the question is this a better solution perhaps than the classic just culture approach?
I mean, I think it's interesting, Tony, that example with the air traffic controller, if we took the classical approach, you're probably going to end up in that reckless violation space, unless you're really curious about those systemic factors that you talked about, at which point you might end up more down the blameless error space. So I think it has a lot of similarities to the Durand Vort example that we've looked at on previous episodes, even though the context of the work is very different. When we're responding to it, when we're trying to understand it, I think we've seen some similarities there. And I think both examples actually would demonstrate the merit of those restorative principles being applied and trying to understand different parties' needs. So obviously with Durand Vort, unfortunately the harm has occurred to somebody that's very, very clear to see. And how do we respond appropriately and justly to that? We've got families that are going to be hurt and affected by that. And so what are their needs and how can we meet them? As well as you've got somebody, the Duranda herself, who is upset. And you talked about feeling maybe shameful and all those kind of things that I think would be applicable in that situation. But the need for the organisation to be truthful as well, which we didn't see in that example. So I think there's certainly merit for the organisational response to be compassionate and human and curious. And also, I think the benefits that organisations that have gone down this route have noted, I think, should be recognised as part of our analysis here. I do have a couple of counters that I think I'd like to raise as well. And I think one of the things is about language. Dekker, when he advocates for the restorative just culture approach, recasts the classical approach that we looked at last time often as a retributive just culture. And I think in terms of language, that slightly mischaracterizes the principles that James Reason was advocating for that we explored before, about, because James Reason isn't talking about retribution in the sense that most people would understand it, about blaming people and punishing people, although reasonable and fair accountability was part of that. Really, he's interested in making sure that people feel that they're going to be treated in an open and transparent manner so they can trust that response, so that they can report the issue, so that organizations can learn and improve. And so I think there's a slight mischaracterization of other ideas. But I think maybe more pertinently, and whilst I know we're going to talk about accountability in a future episode, so we'll try not to get too far into it, I do wonder where the restorative just culture approach that we've outlined responds when we've got extremes of performance. And I'm not talking about the criminal necessarily and that level of extremity, but what if we do have people that are fundamentally unsafe or reckless in the workplace? For example, how do we respond if you've got a scaffolder that doesn't erect a scaffold properly and harm occurs as a result, or you do have a surgeon that is putting people at risk by the nature of their work and their ability to execute their professional responsibilities in a safe manner? Do restorative principles then, are they the most appropriate response? Would be a challenge that I have. I'm interested, Tony, kind of where you see maybe some of the limitations or that we might have on restorative just culture approaches.
Yeah, I think restorative just culture, it has some theoretical constraints that can sometimes come into play. I think one of those is say it can struggle a bit when no harm has been caused, but perhaps where a risk of harm has been created. So, for example, if someone is driving down the road at excessive speed, but they don't have an accident, and you could argue that the community as a whole has been harmed because they've been exposed to this additional risk, but it is very abstract. And of course, most workplaces, they would hope to intervene in situations where a risk of harm has been created before actual harm has occurred. But that's precisely the situation where restorative just culture becomes perhaps a little bit more difficult conceptually. The other is that at the end of the day, it's often hard to get away from the fact that an organisation may still need to judge competing narratives. You have different stakeholders who are giving their account, and which may well be true as they see it. But there may need to be some judgment in there, because what is going to be considered necessary to repair the harm will inevitably be influenced by what is believed to have occurred. So, for example, if I accidentally trip over and hit someone with my fist versus intentionally punching someone, anger management counselling would perhaps be appropriate or inappropriate depending on which of those two scenarios was the one that actually occurred. So I think that there are potentially some conceptual difficulties at times that restorative just culture can struggle with.
Okay. So have we got to a point, Tony, where we recognise that there's merit in this idea, there's value, there's a contribution for the wider idea around just culture that restorative just culture brings to the table and allows us to explore, but it's maybe not a complete solution on its own. And I wonder then, when last episode we looked at the merits and the advantages of a classical just culture approach brings to get rid of or to challenge blame and fear in an organisation, if there's a way we can bring these two approaches together.
Yeah, no, I think there have been some attempts to do that, and I think that's something we'll be talking about in the next video. So, thank you very much for joining us. If you like this video, please do share it, leave a comment. If you have any questions or if it's something that you would like us to talk about in a future video, we'd love to hear from you. So, have a great day, and we'll see you next time.